It's October 1st, 2050. I'm in a hotel in New Pyongyang. For 30 years I've been a journalist, and I've basically watched the world I grew up in just crumble. So tonight, from this room, I'm just trying to piece it all together, trying to finally make sense of how everything fell apart. There's this phrase that just kind of sticks with me, haunts me, really. That old order, the world with all its rules that we just took for granted, turns out it was nothing more than a castle in the sand. And when the tide finally came in, well, here we all are, still walking on that same sand, just trying to find anything that feels like solid ground again.
My name is Microwave, and for the last 3 decades, I've had a front row seat to this whole global shift. Look, this isn't going to be some dry history lesson. This is my story, a first-hand account of how the world's rulebook just got torn up and what managed to crawl out of the wreckage. So, let's get into it. When I first started back in the 2020s, international reporting felt predictable. There was a script, a framework for everything, even for chaos. We really thought we were just reporting on these little blips, these exceptions to the rule. We had no idea the entire system was way more fragile than we could have imagined.
A philosopher, Thomas Kuhn, he had a name for this. He called it a paradigm. It's basically the shared reality that everyone just agrees on. For us, that paradigm was the rules-based international order. And our biggest mistake? We never questioned the game board itself, only how the pieces were moving on it. And this is how it played out, day after day. A crisis would break out somewhere, and my first instinct, it wasn't to look at a battlefield map. No, it was to turn on the UN live stream. We would sit there and dissect diplomatic language like it was some kind of ancient text. Was their concern grave, or was it deep? Believe me, that mattered. Every single report we got from the field had to be squeezed through this filter of international law. We honestly believed we were putting order back into the world.
We really thought that castle was made of stone. But then, starting around 2025 with Donald Trump's second term, we found out it was all just sand. And we watched as a bulldozer, one fueled by years of anger back home, was driven right through its walls. The paradigm? It didn't just crack, it absolutely shattered. And just look at how fast this all went down. First, in 2025, our news meetings completely changed. We stopped waiting for UN press releases and started just refreshing a social media feed. Then, early 2026, the big one hit. The US didn't just leave 1 or 2 treaties, it pulled out of 66 of them. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a demolition. And then came the ultimate test, the Venezuela operation, an abduction that made it crystal clear the old rules were dead. After that, everything that followed was just the new normal.
And this right here was the moment, the eulogy for the old world. I remember the silence in the newsroom when the President of the United States said this out loud. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration that the entire framework we used to make sense of the world was now completely worthless. Now, what's really fascinating is how our own vocabulary had to change. The phrase violation of international law just vanished from my articles. And why? Well, you can't violate rules that nobody acknowledges anymore. Justice got replaced by interests. Agreements became deals. The entire moral language of diplomacy just evaporated, and in its place was the cold, hard language of a balance sheet.
And this wasn't just some intellectual exercise for diplomats and journalists like me. When the map is gone, everybody gets lost. The collapse of that old paradigm unleashed this chain reaction of real-world consequences that touched every single corner of the globe.
And here's the domino effect, laid out perfectly. It all started with the norms eroding. Once America showed the rules were optional, why would anyone else follow them, right? That logic pretty quickly found its way to the world's jugular: energy. Militant groups figured out that attacking a pipeline caused way more global panic than a battlefield victory. And that triggered what we now call the third oil crisis. From there, the path was sadly predictable: economic pain, social unrest, and a terrifying practical new brand of terrorism that targets the very systems that keep our societies alive.
I will never forget a young fighter telling me this, with a smile on his face. It wasn't a boast, it was just a simple statement of fact in this new world. Why bother with the slow, broken machine of diplomacy when you could hold the entire world hostage with a single switch? That was the brutal logic of infrastructure warfare.
And make no mistake, this third oil crisis was different. The first 2, back in the day, they were about states using oil as a political weapon. This was about everyone: states, corporations, even small militias, realizing that energy infrastructure was the most vulnerable and the most valuable target on the planet.
So let's jump back to the world I'm living in now. here in 2050. The result of all this wasn't pure anarchy. It's stranger. It's more complex. I call it managed chaos. It's not a world with no rules. It's a world with competing sets of rules, all layered on top of each other, like a bunch of mismatched blankets. So, the top layer, that's the American block. Here, security is basically a subscription service. You want American drones protecting your shipping lanes? You pay up. Alliances aren't about shared values anymore, they're about quarterly earnings and cost-benefit analysis. It's brutally effective, I'll give it that, but it's got no soul. Then you've got the second layer, the Chinese sphere of influence. They offer a totally different kind of deal. They'll come in and say, we will build you high-speed rail, 5G networks, new ports. We'll give you stability. And the price? Oh, it's just your resources, your data, and your silence on certain political topics. It's a tempting offer for a lot of nations who are just sick of chaos, but the long-term cost to their own sovereignty? It's immense.
The third layer, that's the European Union. They're sort of like curators of a museum, desperately trying to preserve the memory of the old rules-based order. They host conferences, they issue statements about universal values, they champion international law. They're the keepers of the flame, but they just don't have the power to light up the rest of the world anymore.
But then there's the fourth layer, and this one is the most surprising of all. It's not made of nations. It's a network of cities, of major ports, of nonprofits. See, when national governments are failing, the mayor of Lagos makes a deal directly with the Port Authority of Singapore to create a secure shipping lane. It's a pragmatic, bottoms-up kind of order, a whole web of local solutions holding things together now that the grand designs have all failed.
So where does all this leave a journalist? Where does it leave me? For years, my job was to explain the map. But what's my purpose in a world where there are 4 competing maps and they're all drawn in pencil? What's the story I'm even supposed to be telling anymore?
That's the question that's followed me for a long, long time. In a world that's defined by deals and data and just pure desperation, is hope even a relevant idea? Or is it just a luxury from a bygone era?
I think I've finally found an answer. And it's not in some brilliant new treaty or the rise of a new benevolent superpower. It's much smaller than that. It's quieter. Hope lives in the small, tireless acts of repair. The engineer who gets a water pump working again. The mediator who negotiates a ceasefire between 2 villages. The coder who builds a secure, local communication network.
The old castle is gone. It's been washed away for good. But if you look closely, people are still out there on the sand, trying to build. And my job, as I see it now, it's no longer to report on the collapse. It's to find and record the footprints of those who are still building, one single grain of sand at a time, just so their work isn't lost to the wind.